Hello, what is going on, guys? Hockey Guy 1 here. Welcome to my review of Wonder Woman 1984. Wonder Woman 1984 is directed by Patty Jenkins and stars Gal Gadot, Kristen Wiig, Chris Pine, and Pedro Pascal. The story basically takes place in the year of 1984, where Maxwell Lord, who is basically this failing businessman of an oil company, basically retrieves this thing called the Dreamstone, and basically she kind of wishes to become the Dreamstone so he can grant everyone's wishes, basically becoming pretty much the most powerful figure. And basically he kind of trying basically just want as much power as possible, basically, and then Diana has to basically try and stop him before he really takes control of everyone. The acting is pretty good. You got Gal Gadot, who came back as Wonder Woman and did a pretty good job, as she still seemed pretty confident in this movie, and definitely seemed pretty passionate and confident with everything, one of her lines. I think kind of goes for Chris Pine, who came back to see Trevor and basically did a pretty good job, and he did do a pretty good job in this role. The thing with Pedro Pascal is Maxwell Lord, he did a pretty good job as it, and the same thing with Kristen Wiig. She also did a pretty good job in her role. She did feel like the character and did a pretty good job acting in her respective role. Cinematography is alright, I guess. I mean, when they kind of just standing there, just having a conversation and stuff, they do a pretty good job with it. So basically, they kind of show the character's emotions in those scenes, and I will say it's pretty good in those scenes specifically, as it does pretty much capture those scenes pretty well, as it is much easier to kind of do this, but they did do a pretty good job with it specifically. The editing is also alright, similar to cinematography. I mean, when it's just simply standing still in conversations, it's pretty good and does kind of move from one time to another pretty well. When it's just simply just a conversation that they're doing, and it's normally pretty good in those kind of scenes, and I just say they mostly did a pretty good job in those kind of scenes. The action was alright, kind of. I mean, there was a few action scenes that I kind of liked, the little scene where she's chasing Max, basically, through her, basically. I thought that was alright. I mean, it was pretty cool to see the way that they kind of choreographed it, and I just think that one was pretty entertaining for what it is. Set designs are mostly good, as I do like from design of the mall. I do like how they kind of show that, and they do a pretty good job designing that set. The same thing kind of goes for I guess the set at the beginning. I mean, that set was pretty good. I mean, it looked pretty well, the one in the mascara at the beginning. And same thing with just pretty much most of the sets have kind of an 80s thing to it. I mean, well, they don't really add much to the story, but I do feel like they look pretty cool to match the time period a bit. And I do like how they kind of design the sets. They kind of look like that, and basically they do a pretty good job kind of making the sets feel that way. Score was also alright. I mean, I did like how in the whole mall action scene, they did kind of well time the Wonder Woman theme for this movie's version, at least, as basically it did basically come in right when she came in. I do feel like that was well timed. I think they did a pretty good job with that specific part of the score, at least. That said, this movie does have a lot of negatives. To start off, the story is just a complete mess. I mean, it just seems like it kind of lost its way during the movie. I mean, it seemed like it had a decent premise, but the complete execution of this premise is just really off. I mean, there's just so much to this that I feel like they kind of lost their way midway through this movie. It's basically, a lot of this movie is basically just a lot rely on people making these wishes that kind of just relies the plot to move along, just because they make these wishes to move the plot along, basically, and it just doesn't really seem consistent. And basically, a lot of this movie just it's kind of one woman is trying to stop Lauren, and there just needed to be more substance to something like that. But then once they try, like, mixing the cheetah stuff, and it's just not, it just doesn't really work into it. I mean, they tried to fit that in, but, like, it doesn't really fit in. It just feels like they put that in because they wanted cheetah in the movie and really nothing else. I mean, it just doesn't really fit in with the rest of this movie, and it just doesn't really work for this movie's story, and it just kind of, really, you can just remove all the cheat stuff, and basically, the movie's no different from what it is. The whole structure behind the story is what the biggest problem is with this movie story. I mean, it's just really poorly structured. I mean, it kind of starts out with a random scene where Diana's racing in the mascara as a young child. I guess, like, at the end of that scene, they do kind of like send a message there, but like, it doesn't really get brought back into this movie, so it just kind of feels useless. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to kind of start that way, as it's not really brought in anywhere after that, so it just feels like they added it in there just for the sake of it, really. And then they kind of got, like, to 1984, like, yeah, after that, and then showing Wonder Woman apparently undercover, which didn't really make sense because clearly it seemed like they'd know about her from the World War I thing, and so it just feels like it just doesn't really make sense to put her undercover. It just feels like they kind of forgot, like, where the story was moving along, and it just seems like it was completely random. And then it just still, it got into, like, the whole intro and the mall scene, like, that really should have been the opening scene, but because it's not really the opening scene, it just doesn't really feel like much, to be honest. I mean, it really should have just been put in as the opening scene, because the opening scene that they put in the movie just doesn't really get brought anywhere, so it just feels like they kind of has dragged the movie on and tried to get it out to its runtime with that. And for some reason, they have, like, a lot of things, like Diana randomly becoming friends with Barbara after they just met because Barbara likes Diana's power. I mean, it just doesn't really work for the story. It's completely random. It just seems like they just did that again just to try and shove Cheetah into the movie. It's not really effective if they don't do anything with her. It just don't really need to put her here. It's just completely random how they meet up and randomly become friends. It just doesn't really work for the story. It's a completely mess. I mean, then basically there's the whole thing where Maxwell Lord wants the whole Dreamstone, and basically because he still didn't want his oil company to it just feels like that as, like, a starting point for the plot was just not really very smart, to be honest. I mean, I don't really like how that's kind of like a starting point for them, for, like, the whole thing act. I mean, it just doesn't really make sense. I mean, it just kind of like, they don't really establish the character before doing that, so it just doesn't really work story-wise, and it's just kind of random to just do that, to be honest. I mean, it's just, I wish that there's probably something, like, less generic, to be honest, and then basically, like, basically the entire second act has a bunch of things, like, Diana wishes for Steve Trevor to come back unknowingly because they need the plot to move along and needs to find a way to justify Steve Trevor to exist. And then it's just, it just doesn't really work. You know, a lot of this second act is, like, a reliance on Steve and Diana's kind of, like, relationship, and it's just kind of drags on a lot. I mean, a lot of it just doesn't really work a lot. It's basically just a lot, just saying, like, investigating this whole situation with Maxwell, and basically a lot of this stuff that happens, and it just doesn't really work. I mean, she ended up, like, turning a jet invisible because she says she remembers doing it as a kid. I mean, they don't really bring that anywhere other than that, and it's just there because they need to move the plot along, and I wish that there was more to something like that than just trying to move the plot along, because it's just that it needed a bit more substance to something like that. Basically, as the second act moved on, there's kind of like Max doing more and more things that kind of like put the world in danger because he has a lot of power, and it just doesn't really work. A lot of it is really just plot coincidence, just because they need to move the plot along, and it's just really kind of narrow. I mean, they did a lot more with it. I mean, there's just little to no substance to a lot of this movie's plot points, and I wish they did more with them. And then for some reason, now they end up having Barbara have a wish to be just like Diana because they cheat on the movie. There's really no other reason for her to do that. I mean, it just doesn't really work for this movie story. It could have been left out, like pretty much all the other Cheetah stuff, and it's just that it was completely random to put in there because they just couldn't change the plot along just like that. And then you got the climax, which basically has just Diana fighting Barbara or Cheetah, and basically it just ends up fighting her, and then he went around for wish, so she just kind of like heats her up, and it's just didn't really work for that. And I really don't like how like the whole thing to solve this movie's climax is just renounce the wish. I mean, I feel like that's just kind of lazy, to be honest. I mean, I feel like it sounded like they didn't really know what to do to solve the climax, so to just renounce your wish and everything will go back to normal. I mean, it shouldn't really be that easy for something like a dream zone, which is supposed to be really powerful. I mean, and not only that, but like when she gets Max to renounce his wish, the last folks now see things because reason really. I mean, it never really been established before that, and now for some reason they're establishing it just because they need the plot to move along, and that's about it. And it seems like they're kind of forgetting a lot of continuity with stuff like this, and it's just that it seems like they're just caring less and less as the story moves on, as basically the way they solve the climax is just Max renounces his wish, and for some reason, I mean, willpower goes away, and it's just stupid. I mean, they should have done a lot more than that to solve this movie's climax, and basically, yeah, they used to do a lot more to solve this movie's climax. That's about the easiest way to describe it. Then, kind of after the whole thing where Max renounces, which is gonna reunite with family, and says that he wants to be a better dad, which I don't really buy, so it just doesn't really go well with me. And then basically Diana kind of meets the friends in Steve's body, and then after that, the movie does finally ends, and the third act ends as well as the movie. I mean, it's just doesn't really work for anything. It just don't really buy a thing with Max and his family, and I don't really feel much for the ending just because this movie story was just such a mess. Pacing is really just awful. I mean, this movie is 2.5 hours long, and it feels much longer than that because it just drags on for so long. I mean, a lot of this movie's scenes could really be cut out. Like the intro movie really could have been cut out, and just that message that was sent didn't really mean anything for the overall movie. And the same thing kind of goes for anything with Cheetah that's really been cut out, and it just makes the movie feel kind of useless and a lot more slow paced than it really is. I mean, it just makes the movie feel longer, and just they could have done a lot better with this movie. Diana, Wonder Woman, is a poorly written character. I mean, her character is basically just kind of undercover, and for some reason, even though she was clearly seen in the first movie, so it doesn't really make sense that the world doesn't really know about her. And not only that, but the whole Wonder Woman thing, It's just poorly written, really. Really, just so much to her character that is poorly written. Like, basically, there's not really much to her. I mean, she wishes to get Steve back for some reason, and it just doesn't really do much. I mean, a lot of the things that really they add with her character just doesn't really make sense. It's just used there for plot convenience. It's like the whole fact that she can fly is basically just a plot convenience because she was in the air at that moment, and she basically goes against continuity. Like I said, I mean, it just doesn't really work, and a lot of her character is just not really well developed. They didn't do enough with her character. It's just not much to it, and they could have done a lot more with her character in this movie. Steve Trevor, just awful with this movie. I mean, the way they brought him back was completely stupid. I mean, it's basically just Diana wishes for him to come back, and he takes the form of somebody else's body. It's just kind of stupid. I mean, I wish that they did more with that. I mean, it's very hard to bring someone back from the dead, so I feel like they probably just shouldn't have done it at all, but, like, they could have done much better with this movie, with how this was executed, and it just doesn't really work for this movie story. I mean, a lot of the problems with C. Trevor's characters, basically, it's just it doesn't really move along a kind of relationship. I mean, there isn't really much to the relationship besides they talk with each other, I guess, and they just reunite, sort of, and it's just, yeah, there isn't really much to it. They could have brought that a lot further in this movie and kind of, like, progressed it more, but they didn't really progress it at all, to be honest, as basically the only really change that happened is, like, Diana renouncing the wish of it eventually, and he disappears, and it's not really, there isn't really progression. It's more of just something that happened because the plot demanded it, really. I mean, it's just wish that they did more with this, and just wish that they actually kind of progressed this more and just did more with Steve Trevor's character, and basically just, or just not bring it back, or just at least try to, like, bring back in a better way. Maxwell Lord is just a poorly written character. I mean, he's basically supposed to be the main villain in this movie, yet his motivation just seems so selfish. I mean, he wants a lot of power just because his oil business is failing. I mean, and then it's just there's nothing much to him. He just wants a lot of power, and that's about it. I mean, I don't really like that kind of motivation. It just makes him kind of generic. I wish there was more to him. And even if he did, at the end, kind of, like, promise to be a better father to his kids, I still don't really buy that, because his character just doesn't really do anything about that beforehand. It just doesn't really make sense to put that in the movie. As I said before, Barbara or Cheetah basically could be left out of the story, but, like, to make that worse, like, her character just, it's kind of stupid. I mean, the way that they make her a villain is that she's jealous of Diana since she wants to be just like her. It's just a terrible motivation to kind of, like, have for a secondary villain, and it's just kind of stupid, because, like, not only could they leave her out of the plot, they very easily could have given her a better motivation than that, and it's just kind of stupid to kind of give someone like Cheetah, like, that kind of petty motivation. Visual effects are just awful. I mean, in Cheetah's design especially is what I would look out for the visual effects, and it kind of looks like it was just recycled out of the Cats movie, and just don't really like the looks of it, and it's just, it looked much better, really, and they could have done a much better job with it, and especially since, like, this is supposed to be, like, a big budget movie, they definitely could have done a much better with that. And saying, like, the worst, like, all the other visual effects just don't really look very convincing. Like, whenever they kind of have Diana flying, it doesn't really look that convincing, really, and it's just, a lot of the things kind of go with the lasso as well. They just they could have done a much better job with that. It just kind of seemed like they downgraded the visual effects of this movie from the last one, and it just feels like they could have done a lot better with the visual effects in this movie. As I said earlier, the cinematography is alright, but like there are definitely things about it that aren't really very good. I mean, I feel like that a lot of the camera angles that they added for action scenes are kind of useless, and they just kind of did it just for the sake of it. They didn't really need to be there much, didn't really do much for the movie. And the same thing kind of goes for the editing in this movie, and like I said, it was alright earlier. It's really choppy in a lot of action scenes, and as they're just moving camera angles way too much, and it just comes off as really choppy, especially like in the opening scene. Like there's definitely a lot of camera angles in that didn't really need to be there, and just to make things kind of worse, like there's a lot of editing and that's just really choppy. It just doesn't really feel smooth. It's just really choppy in those kind of scenes. As I said before, the score was alright. I mean, there are things about it that don't really work with it. Like a lot of the songs just kind of like feel like they're just there randomly just because they needed a score behind it, and a lot of it just doesn't really feel like it's getting you into the scenes, and it just feels like a lot of it's just random, and I wish that he definitely could have done a lot better with it, though it also could have been much worse. As I said, he said it was alright, but it's just that they still could have done better with the score, and it just feels like they're not really trying to get you into the moment, more so just choosing a score just because they kind of needed one. Overall, Wonder Woman 1984 was such a disappointing movie, and it really could have been much better than what it was, but it ended up just being a horrible movie and a huge downgrade from the last movie. So I'm going to give Wonder Woman 1984 a 3.5 out of 10. That was my review of Wonder Woman 1984. What are your thoughts on Wonder Woman 1984? Tell me in the comments below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.